Focus on Braille, brought to you by Sight Loss Friendly Church from Torch Trust.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Focus On session, Focus on Braille. My name is Matthew Horspool. I'm the Sight Loss Friendly Church advisor at Torch Trust, and I'll be doing most of the talking during this session. Joining me is Becky Davis. Becky's the Sight Loss Friendly Church coordinator. And so this session is about Braille. There's a particular reason why we're doing Braille in October. The second Thursday in October is World Sight Day. This is why we're having Sight Loss Sunday on the second Sunday in October, because it corresponds with that very nicely. There's an organisation called Sight Scotland, which was formerly Royal Blind, and it ran the Royal Blind School in Edinburgh. And Sight Scotland some years ago decided that the week of World Sight Day they were going to mark as National Braille Week. So next week, the week of the 11th of October, will be National Braille Week, and Sight Scotland normally do some curriculum resources for that, and they put resources out, your Braille crosswords and things like that for people to do, usually in primary school. And there's various advocacy type sessions going on around National Braille Week to raise the profile of Braille, and that's all sort of being finalised as we speak from organisations like Sight and Sound and UCAF and the Braillists Foundation and things like that. So we thought that it would tie in very nicely to do it, to do a focus on Braille about now. The other time we potentially could have done it would have been the 4th of January. The 4th of January is World Braille Day, and it's World Braille Day because it's Louis Braille's birthday. Louis Braille was born in 1809. He was the inventor of the Braille code, and he was blinded early in childhood due to an accident in his father's workshop. And so he was blinded, realised he wanted to be able to read, and had come across a system of a night blind tactile system used in the military, and thought it was a good idea, but he could expand upon it. So he produced the Braille system. And a useful sort of thing, an interesting bit of a trivia for those who are Sight Loss Friendly churches, Louis Braille was in fact a church organist. So the Braille music code came about at the same time as the Braille literary code, so that Braille could read sheet music and he could write down his compositions and write down, musically, what it was that he wanted to play on the organ on a Sunday. So that's where Braille music came from, and that's Braille's connection to the church. Prior to Braille, people generally either didn't read at all, or they read very slowly using quite a complicated system of raised letters. It was raised print letters that people used to make out of string and wire and things like that, and it actually took quite a long time. Even though Braille was born in 1809, we didn't really get Braille, in the mainstream, as it were, until about the 1900s and possibly the 1920s, 1930s, before we ended up with the Braille system, the English Braille system that we have at the moment. So, what is Braille? The technical definition: Braille is a series of raised dots which enables blind people to read and write. It's divided into cells, each cell having 6 dots arranged like a domino. So that they're numbered 1, 2 and 3 down the left hand side, and 4, 5 and 6 down the right hand side. So 3 down and 2 across. A Braille cell can represent a letter or a symbol, like a full stop or a comma or something, or a group of letters known as a contraction. So, for example, there's the special signs. One cell on its own can represent and, or for, or the, or various things like that. You can also combine cells together. So, for example, to do numbers, you actually just use the letters A to J, but before the first digit in the sequence, you put a special sign, which means we're going into numbers mode, and that sign is called the number sign. Similarly, for capital letters, a capital A looks the same as a lowercase a, except that before that letter you put a dot to show that it's a capital letter. And there are certain signs that are sort of reserved for those things. So contractions can be multiple. So for example, dot 5 and the letter K means no, dot 5 and the letter L means Lord, various things. That .5M means mother and things like this. So although there are only 64 unique combinations of dots per cell, and that includes the space, there are actually 180 different contractions in the Braille system overall. There were 189, in fact there were slightly more than that, but over the years we've tried to disambiguate some of Braille to make it work with computers and things, and so the current number of contractions is about 180, although people may like to devise their own if they're doing their own shorthand and things like this. The size of a Braille cell is roughly equivalent to the size of a print letter at 24 point. So at this point, I'm going to try and actually show what that means. You should at the moment be able to see on the screen some small type at about size 12 and some larger type in Tiresias font at about size 24. And then there might be some Braille at the bottom. If we scroll down to the bottom of that page, you can hopefully now see two different blocks of Braille dots. The first of those blocks, so this is Psalm 40 verse 5, I think. The first of those blocks is what it would look like in Braille, as in the actual Braille dots. The second block shows the full Braille cell, and it should show some shadow dots where there aren't any Braille dots. So for example, if only dot 1 is visible in the Braille cell, there should be shadow dots in dots 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 to show where they would be were they there, if you see what I mean. So I'm hoping that people can see that. I'll give a couple of minutes or a few seconds just in case either people can't see it or they need me to scroll up and down or don't understand what they're seeing and want me to clarify anything.
If you just go one along, Matthew, to the page screen 2, I think that will show the Braille without the shadow dots. Yeah.
So that's the Braille without the shadow dots. So hopefully that gives you some indication of how big it is, relative to print, even with contractions. And that is, by the way, that is contracted Braille. That's fully contracted Braille. Even with the contractions, you're not going to make it the same size as print, and hopefully that shows that. So how Braille is produced. Braille, it's traditionally embossed onto relatively heavyweight paper. So if you've got standard copier paper, that's generally about 80 to 120 GSM. If you get paper from a solicitor, it's generally around the 100 GSM mark. You can actually emboss Braille dots onto paper that's that thin. But the dots tend to be, I think one person described them as quite watery. They don't last very long. They're not terribly easy to read. They're quite easy to accidentally, if you're reading with a too heavy a touch, they're quite easy to accidentally scrub out. So we don't recommend Braille on paper that thin. It can be done in an emergency, but sort of cardstock style. If you imagine a birthday card or a Christmas card, something of about that sort of thickness does Braille dots very well. Somewhere between 120 and 160 GSM. So you could go slightly thinner than a birthday card if you needed to. But yeah, we're talking that sort of thickness really, or slightly thinner, but nowhere near as thin as normal paper. And at the most basic level, you actually would produce it one dot at a time. So I'm going to try and switch cameras. Hopefully you can see I've got a frame on the desk. This is actually a little pocket frame. It takes 3x5 index cards. It's a little metal frame and it opens up. If I open the frame up, hopefully you can see that I can put a 3x5 index card onto the frame, close it, and then use a little stylus, which is just slightly bigger than a slightly bigger head than a pin. And using a stylus, we'll be able to punch each dot separately, if you like. I'll just sorry, this will make you seasick, I think, this camera, but I'll just make this a bit neater in the frame once I've settled down. So hopefully you can see now that I've got a stylus and I can literally punch one dot at a time into the frame, and I have to do it backwards because I'm punching down into the paper. But that's how we used to do it. And then you would take the paper out of the frame, and you'd be able to see, you'd be able to feel the dots that you've done. The advantage of that system is it's extremely cheap. You can buy those frames for £5, and you can buy the paper, from an office supply store or what have you, and it's very easy to do. The downside is, of course, it takes ages. So we moved on very quickly in the 1950s or so in the UK, well, actually in the US, and then the UK imported it, to a machine called the Perkins Brailler. And I think the Perkins Brailler is probably what most people think of when they think about typing. So this is the Perkins Brailler, again on the mobile phone camera. So you can see it looks a bit like a typewriter with 6 keys and a space bar. It's quite noisy, but considerably quicker. And the advantage of this is that it brailles upwards. So you could actually, if there was paper in here, you could put a finger in, sort of, read what you were brailing as you went along. And there's a key to backspace, or you can pull the carriage back to the start of the line. If I roll the paper in a bit, there's a key to move to the next line and to eject the paper one line at a time. So this was 1950, 1951, this was first built. They cost, as you can tell, this is ancient. I think this might have actually been manufactured in the 1960s. I got it secondhand and was very, very happy with it. They cost somewhere about £500 to £700 new. But you can get them secondhand. They last a long time. Like I say, this would have been built in about the 60s and would have had very little maintenance to keep it running. They were built very, very solidly. And so a lot of the time people put them on eBay. An old person will sadly pass away or go into a home or something. Their children will see this old Braille machine, think it's old, which of course it is, not realise the worth of it, put it on eBay for very cheap, £50, £100. £200 is expensive on the second-hand market for a Perkins because people just don't realise the value of it. And they are very, very good, very, very sturdy machines. They cannot produce Braille on both sides of the page. It's possible to do Braille on both sides of the page using the frame method, and you can get frames that are bigger than the one that I showed you. You can do double-sided Braille with a Perkins. Sadly, you can't, but that's its only real limitation. I'm going to move the camera, again on the mobile phone, I'm going to move the camera over to the other side of the room. I don't know how well you can actually see this. I'll stop moving about. It should be pointing at something that looks a little bit like an old dot matrix printer. And if we pull the flap up, you can see there's paper tractors and things like that. This is an entry-level Braille embosser. A Perkins Brailler can actually typically, if you're on a Perkins, you can type nearly as quickly as you can touch type. This machine here that I'm pointing the camera at now can actually do Braille at, about a sheet of paper every 30 seconds, and it can do double-sided Braille. So this is brilliant. It costs £2,500. It's not cheap. However, it doesn't require ink, and it lasts a long time. I had one as a child, so I had one bought for me in the year 2002. It wore out and eventually needed to be replaced in 2019, just before the pandemic. So, they last a long time. And I say need very, very little maintenance, don't require ink. So actually over the 15-20 year lifespan of the machine, it probably doesn't cost much more to maintain than a printer, but the initial outlay is very, very high. I say about £2,500. At Torch, we have a machine that costs more like £15,000. It can produce Braille even faster than this, but I'll run it. The big disadvantage of this machine, it's brilliant. It connects via a USB port to the computer and is driven by some special software. The huge disadvantage of it is the noise. So I'll emboss something, but before I do, I'll show that it's in a cabinet and I can pull the lid of the cabinet closed. And so what I'll do halfway through the embossing process is do that so that you can hear the difference that it makes, and hopefully Zoom's noise cancelling won't noise cancel the embosser out. But let's see how we go. So yes, as you can see, I'll move this camera because it's getting hard to hold. As you can see, these are quite noisy. The cabinets themselves, if you actually want to go and buy a proper cabinet, can be almost expensive as the embosser itself. But an old wardrobe is usually a good bet, or an old cupboard with some acoustic treatment. You know, get some acoustic tiles or something for £30 off Amazon or something, and put some insulating in it, and that will tend to do the job. But you will need something, because an embosser on its own, especially like that, is extremely noisy. The big embosser that we have at Torch is actually built into its own cupboard. So actually the big embosser at Torch is quieter than that small one, because it's got all of the insulation sort of built into it. I'm conscious that I've talked for quite a long time. I'll stop at this point and check that everybody could see everything that they needed to see, and that there aren't any questions at this point.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
I just wanted to know what you do with, say, for example, a Perkins Braille or even the small frame. What happens when you make a mistake? You can't tip exit out.
Right, yes. In my box of tricks, yeah, so you could just scrub it out with the back of a fingernail. I tend to do that quite often. I'm on the Me camera rather than the mobile phone camera, and I'll just hold it up to the camera. I don't know if you can see this rather offensive weapon looking thing.
Yeah. Dangerous.
But, yes, it does look rather dangerous. This is quite a nice one. When I before I worked at Torch, I worked at a school for the blind with a metalwork, a woodwork metalwork shop in it, and they needed a project, so they made loads of Braille erasers out of metal. You can't buy them like this. They're a lot cheaper and made of wood in the shop. But yeah, basically find the dot that you want and use this. Use the pointy end of that to just go down on the dot and rub it out. And once it's rubbed out, you can then Braille over the top of it.
Yeah.
If it goes really wrong, then the other thing you can do is the full Braille cell, so all 6 dots, does actually mean something. It means the word for, F-O-R. But if you do more than one of them, so if you've made a mistake, if you've written, I don't know, I can't think of an example, but if you've written a word incorrectly, if you block out the entire word with 4 signs and then write the word again, then people will skip over the 4 signs. It's the equivalent of rubbing out, I suppose, or
Okay.
crossing out.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a bit about the implications of paper Braille. Not only is paper thicker than standard paper, it also tends to be a little bit wider. It doesn't have to be. You can get A4 Braille paper, but realistically it tends to be a little bit wider because you've got more stuff to try and put on it, so to account for the size of the Braille cells. Even having accounted for that, even having had the paper a bit wider than A4, one side of print, typically we're talking about 2 to 2.5 sides of Braille. And also Braille tends to become unwieldy if more than about 50 sheets of Braille, that's 100 pages double-sided, are bound together. So books, a 200-page book in Braille, you could be looking at sort of 500 pages of print. Sorry, other way around. A 200-page book in print, 500 pages of Braille, thereabouts. And that 500 pages will be divided into 500, 5 volumes of 100 pages each. So the term volume in Braille is used a lot. You'll get a book. This book is in 5 volumes. This book is in 6 volumes, and so on and so on. I'll just turn around, as you might be able to see from the background, and we tell people not to have cluttered backgrounds, and I'm aware that mine is. I've got shelves and shelves full of books. I'll just I'll pick a hymn book at random. Here we are, Common Praise. Here's one that I found earlier. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I'll get the stack of Common Praise books out and put them I'll hold them up to the camera. So the Common Praise is a hymn book used quite a lot in the Church of England. It was superseded by the new Hymns Ancient and Modern, actually. But hopefully you can tell, like a hymn book that, I mean, this is a fairly typical hymn book. It's got sort of 700 hymns in it or so. That is the whole book in Braille.
Wow. Massive.
Yeah, it's not manageable. If I put it on my lap and just hold up, this is 1 volume of the book. So even that volume is actually quite sizable. And if I turn it around the other way so that you can see how big the pages are, and it's all bound very nicely. It's bound with a metal binder, so you can actually open it and fold the pages back on themselves. Except this is a very old version, and it's that the pages are a bit worn out. But yeah, I've opened it up to page 35, and we're still on the copyright information. But yeah, so very unwieldy. This is why it's so important. I mean, there are various reasons why it's so important, but this is one of the big reasons why it is just so important. Please, if you have a Braille reader in the church, and you really do need to be organised, because if you're not organised, if the Braille reader doesn't know what's coming up, it's just not practical for the Braille reader to take the entire hymn book to church every week just so she can join it. Really needs to know the hymn numbers in advance. It does actually say on the label of the spine what numbers are in what books. So if you know in advance, you can bring just the right volumes. And the beauty of something like Common Praise is it's organised very well. So all the Christmas hymns are all bound together, and all the Easter hymns are bound together. So you could actually get away. I used to bring the hymn books to church as a child, and I used to generally get away. If I had to bring 5 volumes, it was a hard day. I could generally bring 1 or 2, and it would be fine. I'll just put those back on the shelf, but hopefully you can see the implications of that. Other than that, Braille's brilliant. Apart from the huge amount of bulk, you can actually buy plastic. You can. So I've been talking about brailing on paper, and brailing on paper is, of course, what we do most of the time. You can buy sheets of self-adhesive plastic, and you can use that in conjunction with a Perkins Brailler to produce labels. So if you've got signage and you need to retrofit Braille to your signage in your church, you can get these sheets and you can Braille on them, or indeed you can load them into an embosser. You can get them with the tractor strips on. You can also, and it's very remiss of me, I don't actually know where mine is. You can also get the 9mm or 12mm Dymo tape that you would load into a Dymo gun. There's a specially adapted Dymo gun. So I'm talking about there's a dial on the top with letters, and you spin it round to the appropriate letter and then squeeze the trigger. You can get one of those for about £30. They're not that expensive, and they will do Braille labels onto 9mm or 12mm tape. And that's another way of very quickly adding Braille if you've got signage that you need to do. And even a bit of Braille helps. If you have a sign that says men and you have another sign that says women, the chances are quite likely they're toilet signs. You don't need to be terribly explicit as long as there's something useful on the sign. Don't be afraid to do that. If you're commissioning new signs, it is actually possible to emboss the Braille into the plastic or into the metal that makes the sign, but that's not a domestic job. You would need the person who you've commissioned the sign from. You'd need that to be done by them, really, and we can advise at Torch about ways to do that if that's what you want to do. The other thing to point out at this point is that Braille can be increasingly used without paper, most commonly via a refreshable Braille display. So I'm going to pick up the mobile phone. So it's pointed at my keyboard, and hopefully you can see the keyboard, but underneath the keyboard, sort of, closest to me, hopefully you can see a machine that is, so this is essentially one line of Braille, and whether you can see it or not, I don't know. I'm going to try it and hope for the best. Hopefully you can see
We can, Matthew. Yeah.
the dots moving so I'm actually panning backwards at the moment. Specially adapted labelling gun, which will, and then pan to the next line, produce Braille labels, or pan to the next line, electronic Braille labeler can be, pan to the next line. But so I'm reading my notes for this session, so that this is actually connected to the computer by USB. The words, the notes are in Microsoft Word, and they're being transmitted, and I can read them one line at a time. It's possible to disconnect that and to copy the notes directly to the machine. So, for example, if I was in the congregation and the church could email me the order of service in advance, I could copy the order of service to this machine, and instead of having to emboss it on paper and carry lots of paper around, I could have the hymn book on here, I could have the order of service on here, and I could read it. And as you can hear, while I'm moving around, you can hear the click of the button, but it's not, if the whole congregation was singing a hymn while I was doing that, that wouldn't be terribly distracting, I wouldn't think. So this is a row of 40 cells made of small metal or plastic pins, which individually raise and lower electronically to form Braille cells. You can probably see the keyboard above, dots 1, 2, 3 and 4, 5, 6, a bit like the Perkins keyboard, and indeed I can actually use that. If I wanted to type in Braille on the computer, I can touch type fairly quickly, so I don't tend to use this ability, but if I wanted to Braille, I could absolutely do that, and it would translate into print very nicely. This machine is a dumb machine, if you like. It can literally just read what you tell it to read. There are more advanced machines which are slightly bigger. I mean, I'll point. There you go. I'll point it at my Braille Sense 6, which is my note taker. So this, as you can see, you can still see the Braille cells on the bottom. The keyboard is a bit bigger. And this machine actually is an Android tablet that's been specially adapted. So this can do everything. This can do emails, it can do internet browsing, you can install Zoom on it, it's even got a camera on the back, and it's got some specialist apps that use that. So for example, this particular machine, it's not its primary purpose by any means, but this particular machine, it's got a special mode where you can point it at your clothes and it will tell you what colour they are and things like this. It's very, very, very powerful. It's actually quite a nice machine to use. I quite enjoy using this. Not very nice when you have to pair it to the computer. So it's good to have the option of both. But that would mean, whereas with the Braille display, the church would have to email me the order of service in advance, and I'd have to actually copy it. With the Braille Sense, with the note taker, if the church had forgotten to, they could actually email it to me, 2 minutes before the service on the Sunday morning. And as long as there was Wi-Fi, I could log into emails on this machine and access it that way. Or, okay, the hymn has changed at short notice, no problem. I'll log onto the internet and Google the words to the updated hymn. So that's, there are advantages to that. Unfortunately, price is not one of them. A Braille display costs, this particular Braille display costs about $2,500. And I was very fortunate to have a grant from actually through Access to Work, because I got it as part of my job at Torch, to pay for that for me. They're not really very affordable. Again, though, the lifestyle is pretty good. I mean, I would expect this to keep running for a good 10 years before the dots start to sort of wear out, and I could probably send it back to be serviced and get those dots, clear all the dust out and everything, and get another 5 years out of it. So fairly long lifespan, but yeah, very, very high upfront cost. The Braille Sense, the note taker, add another 2,000 on that. You're talking sort of 4,500 or so. Very, very expensive equipment. But if it's what you need, then it works. And as I say, there are grants available for this sort of stuff. You can get machines more cheaply with fewer cells. There's a cheaper version of my Braille display for £1,200, which has half the number of cells, and some people use that. There are also, sorry about all the camera movement, there are also much cheaper devices on the market now. These retail for closer to £500, so we're starting to get a bit more affordable now. Yeah, £500 in Braille terms is very cheap. This is called the Orbit Reader, and it uses a different type of technology to achieve the same result. The only problem is, I'll turn it on, so you can hear it's refreshing much more slowly. And much more noisily. Not offensively noisily. If I was on a train or something, I'd be quite happy to read a book off this and it would be fine. I wouldn't have an issue with it. If I was standing at the front of church, at the lectern, reading a reading and the microphone was sensitive, perhaps I wouldn't want to read it off this. I'd probably prefer to read it from paper. The other advantage, I should say, of paper, I'll put this phone back down. The other advantage of paper is that you can have multiple lines. If you've only got one line of text displayed at a time, you get used to it, but it's not the same sort of reading experience as being able to scan by paragraph very, very quickly. So there are certain things. I sing in the choir at Coventry Cathedral. I would always sing from paper, because the ability to just move up and down the page very quickly is you can navigate through electronic Braille very, very quickly if you know what you're looking for, but just the ability to just move around the page is not there yet. They are looking at multi-line Braille displays. One has been released. They've made 90 of them so far. They cost £1,800. So actually, when you consider that you could pay £2,500 for 40 cells or £1,800 for 360, it's a pretty good price. But it's big and heavy and doesn't have a battery, and it will get there, but it's not there yet, really. I can put my iPhone, I won't demonstrate it, but I can actually put my iPhone into a special Braille input mode. That's the other big advantage of Braille tech. So if I put my phone into landscape mode, it has a facility where it puts a Braille keyboard up on the phone, and I can type with 6 fingers. And that makes sending text messages much easier. I've got to a convenient stopping point, so I'll stop again in case anybody has any questions about any of that.
Yes, I would. It's me again, I'm afraid. Sorry, Matthew. Just a thought, really, but that all of that equipment is probably too much for us to use as a church. We would hardly be using it more than perhaps once a year. It seems a lot of money to spend out for that. Unless we went for something like the small frame. We only have one lady who reads Braille. Last year, somebody made a Christmas card for her by researching on the internet how to write Happy Christmas in Braille and using on the card. I think she used a biro. About the end of a biro. Oh
yes, and just stabbed it through the page.
Yes. And that seemed to work quite well. And she had great fun researching it and doing it. And I think part of that was all about understanding other people's needs and trying to be inclusive on it, really. So I would say that we're very small scale users of Braille. And again, I think I've mentioned this to Torch Trust before, that we have a directory, a church directory, like a lot of churches do, and that's updated yearly, and it would be nice to be able to do that in Braille for Maureen. Just a once a year thing. I think she would find that helpful, but I'm not sure that we can invest such large amounts of money just
no absolutely. So the things I was just showing, like the Braille displays and things like that, it would be up to Maureen to invest in that sort of technology anyway, I think. Okay. It's a bit like, in the same way that you would buy yourself a new laptop. Yes. A blind person might buy themselves a Braille display, or indeed might seek funding to do so.
Yes.
There are various pots of money from RNIB and places like that to subsidise or, completely subsidise the purchasing of equipment like that.
Yeah.
In terms of producing the directory, if Maureen had a way of, a Braille device of some description, then you could email it. Failing that, I think we would be talking about an embossing job. However, you're right. For a church to buy a Braille embosser, they could do it if they wanted to, and obviously it'd be wonderful if they did, but it's not really an appropriate use of money necessarily in a parish with small levels of income. You might have a local resource centre for the blind. I've forgotten where you are, I do apologise.
In Chippenham in Wiltshire.
Okay, so there'll be something like a Wiltshire Association for the Blind, and they may have a Braille embosser in their resource centre, and so it may be possible if you speak to the resource centre to say, look, Resource Centre for the Blind, Society for the Blind Association, might be called Wiltshire Vision or something if they're, if they're going, all modern. But it might be worth having a chat with them and saying, look, we will occasionally need to produce some Braille. If we send you some documents, could you do it for us? Or, could we be allowed to come in for, an hour on a Friday morning when it's quiet and use your equipment? And resource centres will generally be fairly accommodating to those sorts of requests. They'll probably just do it for you, or they might charge you for the paper, but that would be a useful way forward. Or if there were several churches, I know of a couple of setups where there's a Churches Together circuit. So one of the churches in the Churches Together has purchased the embosser and has the embosser for all of the churches in that area to use. I've just found one on Google, Wiltshire Site it's called. Yes, that sounds about right.
Yeah, they've got an extensive website, so I will investigate that later.
Yeah, that'd be where I'd go first. And if that's not possible, there are various organisations that will do Braille transcription if a church can't do their own. I don't know if a directory is the sort of thing that Torch would necessarily do, but get in touch with us, because there are various organisations that would do it, PIA or All Formats or even RNIB. And indeed, if you're a blind person yourself, so if you gave Maureen a print copy of the directory, she may be able to get in touch with RNIB, and RNIB may actually be able to do it for her because she's a blind person asking for it. May be able to do it for free, but there's a long waiting list. It would take sort of 6 months plus to get that done. But that is a route that I've used in the past.
Right.
I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what Braille can't do, which is actually very little, but there are things that you need to know about. For example, it can't do, you can't do small Braille and large Braille and normal size Braille. Well, actually you can, but you can't really, the embosser needs to actually be set at the start of the print job to do small Braille or large Braille or normal Braille. You can't change it halfway through a job. So for example, where in print you would normally use slightly larger text in order to indicate a heading, that sort of device is not an appropriate device to use in Braille. And similarly, you can't do italicized Braille, you can't do bolded Braille. You sort of can do underlined Braille if you really wanted to, but it's quite a lot of effort to achieve that. So all of those visual devices that are used a lot in print are generally not used in Braille at all. There are signs. We talked about you put a dot in before a letter to make it capital. You can put another series of dots before a letter to indicate that in print it is bold, or in print it is underlined, or in print it is in a different font or a different size. And sometimes you would do that if something is legitimately needing to be emphasized. You would put something there to point out. So if you have an email and it says the meeting will begin at 3 p.m. and 3 p.m. is in bold, you would mark that in Braille to show, yes, this is in bold, so that the blind person knew it was in bold. If the bold was just for a heading, most likely that would be stripped out. There's no point. There are various devices we can use to mark a heading in Braille. use of blank space is quite common. Like, you know, 1 or 2 blank lines before a heading is quite a common way to do it. A blank line followed by centered text is a slightly more important heading than a blank line followed by text at the left-hand margin. Various types of line. We don't tend to underline at the start. We tend to actually put an underline at the end of a section. But an underline of dots represents the end of a subsection versus an underline of dashes that indicates the end of a main section, if you like. If it's a really important thing, you could start a new page. So there are ways of doing it, but the ways of doing it in Braille are not the same ways as doing it in print. And devices that are used in print, so for example, you might have a running header and a running footer. You can do both of those in Braille, but the amount of information that you can include on the header line is very restricted unless you want the header to go over 2 lines, which is not ideal really. So a Braille header might literally be chapter 1 or, you know, John 1 or something, you know. That's about as much information as you can cram onto a header, or possibly, if it's a short one, possibly the title of the chapter if it's a book or something. But you wouldn't generally get much more than that on the header. And if the book is transcribed well, you might have the print page number at the top left-hand corner and the Braille page number at the top right-hand corner. If it's not transcribed so well, you'll just have the Braille page number. So this is quite important. If you're in a home group and you say, right, we're all going to start reading at page 406, the Braille will not necessarily have page 406. So it's kind of important that you specify something else that's relevant, the name of the chapter, or possibly the first few words of the paragraph, so that people can actually, you know, find that sort of stuff out. The other big limitation of Braille is images. You can do tactile images. I'll get some out if I can remember where I've put them. You can do tactile images, but you can't embed them in the main text very easily. So, do you know what? I was going to get railway maps out, but I think I've just found a load of music notation images, which might be a bit easier to demonstrate. There we go. Music notation. I'll put these on the desk and then point the iPhone camera at them. There we go. I can't remember exactly what these are. Figure 23A, but it doesn't tell me what figure 23A is. And there's figure 23B and figure 23C. These will be, they'll be music notes, is what they'll be, of some sort. But I'm not entirely sure what sort. But these will have had to have been produced in a very specialist way, using specialist paper and specialist technology. So they're not actually in line in the text. This is a music theory textbook, and there's 5 volumes of music theory textbook and 2 separate volumes of diagrams. And in the body of the music theory textbook, it will say, for the diagram associated with this, please turn to page, well, it doesn't even say, please turn to figure 23A in the diagram books. And that's really the only way you can do it. You can't do it in line. And the images are quite large, and it says there's some Braille here. It says the middle part is, but anyway, they're quite large and quite low resolution. So if you had an illustration, if you had a picture of a person wearing glasses with dark hair, you wouldn't be able to convey all of that in a tactile form. You might be able to convey a chart if it took the whole page. You might be able to convey a graph if it took the whole page. But quite often, I'll put this down now, quite often it's a lot easier just not to bother brailing the pictures at all. Sometimes if they're useful, they will be described. Other times they'll just be ignored, or a note in the Braille text that says there's a picture here not reproduced. So that is basically all I wanted to say. If you want to produce your own Braille, you'll need an embosser, or to use the embosser of a resource centre. Back in June, we did a session on preparing accessible documents, focus on making your documents accessible. The same principles for making large print documents apply for making Braille documents. Please make sure, if at all possible, that those documents are styled up with headings at the right levels and things like that for the best results with a Braille embosser. As long as that's done, the translation software and the Braille embosser will do a fairly good job of doing it. And if you want to obtain Braille resources for yourself, if it's a book, if it's a hymn book or a Bible or a Bible a commentary or a Lent course or something, contact Torch. We will have either done it ourselves or RNIB or actually Scottish Braille Press, going back to Royal Blind and Sight Scotland and National Braille Week. Scottish Braille Press have actually done quite a lot of Braille transcription over the years. So either we will have it or they will have it, or RNIB will have it, or we will be able to transcribe it thanks to good relationships with the publishers. If it's Braille that you've done yourself, so service books, orders of service, there are all sorts of organisations that will do this sort of thing, and I think the best thing to do is to get in touch with us, because they all have slightly different pricing models depending on how long the document is and how many copies you need and stuff like that. And so we'd be able to work with you to work out which companies are likely to give you the best deal for the particular type of service book or newsletter or document that you're trying to produce. So I'll leave it there. If there's any final questions from people, I'm happy to take them.
Just a point of interest, Matthew. How do you do different languages in Braille?
How long's a piece of string?
No, if it's a big involved...
Well, it depends on the language. So English Braille has obviously evolved because English, the contraction system and things like that, and the mathematics system and things like that. But the basics of English Braille in terms of the alphabet and punctuation and all that sort of thing date back to Louis Braille's alphabet himself. And so Louis Braille was French.
Yeah.
So Braille actually started as a French code that we adapted for English. But A, B, C, D, E, all the way down to Z are the same as in French and indeed in Spanish and German and all of those languages that use the Roman alphabet. So if you were doing Braille in any of those languages, it would be a fairly simple job. The alphabet would be the same. The punctuation, there might be slight differences, but nothing untoward really. You deal with it. There are special signs for the different accents, like the grave and the acute and things like that. But there's only a handful of those, and you could pick those up fairly quickly. I used to transcribe French textbooks and got very good at being bilingual between English and French Braille. That there wasn't much in it really, and you get to a point where you start reading something and your head kind of automatically goes into French mode or English mode depending on what it is, or indeed into music mode or maths mode or what have you. It's just an extension of that.
That's interesting.
If you're dealing with Russian or Greek or Sanskrit or any of these other Chinese, Japanese languages, then it gets harder because they're not based on the Roman alphabet.
Yeah.
And so there are different. There is a Greek alphabet and there's a Russian alphabet, and it's loosely based on the Roman alphabet. But Hebrew, things like that. Yeah, there's a different code, and you'd need to just learn the new code from scratch, really.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Well, it doesn't look like there's any other questions, so I'll bring the recording to a close here. Thank you very much for coming along.
To find out more about Sight Loss Friendly Church, please get in touch. Telephone 01858 438 260. SLFC@torchtrust.org, or visit our website sightlossfriendlychurch.org.uk. Sight Loss Friendly Church from Torch Trust.